The day the sky felt like an anvil, Grant Ellison decided he was done. 37 years of sunburnt work had worn him thin, and the last 2 winters had finished the job. Fever took his wife, the drought took his herd, and the bank circled what little he had left. By mid-morning he had a hole behind the cabin cut into the hardpan, 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, measured neat as a ledger line for a man who believed there was nothing left to fight for. He would tidy the edge, scrawl a note, hand the deed to fate, and close the book with his father's old Colt. But the land didn't agree. A thread of sound drifted on the hot wind, not the scrape of mesquite or the cry of a hawk, but a human voice, thin and strained, calling from the front gate. Grant stiffened. Land snatchers had played tricks before, sending decoys to pull a rancher out where a rifle could do the rest. He grabbed his Winchester and rounded the corner, shoulders tight. The sight, waiting there, knocked the breath from him. A girl, barely 20 by the look of her, had slid down the rough plank gate and folded to the dust. Her dress was ripped to ribbons. Her dark hair stuck to her cheeks with sweat and grit. What stopped Grant cold wasn't the torn fabric or the dirt. It was her belly, heavy with child, 8 months along if his trail-worn eyes judged right, and blood seeping dark at the hem. Her lips tried to form words and failed. He crouched, and the whisper reached him like a prayer. "Please don't let my baby die." The sentence struck like a bullet. For months, he'd studied the end. Now life, tiny, fierce, and begging, lay on his doorstep. The Winchester slid from his hand. He scooped her up, startled by how light she felt despite the burden she carried, and hurried inside. Her skin burned under his palm, breath shallow and ragged. Rope burns ringed her wrists, finger marks stained her arms. Someone had treated her like stock to be hauled, not a person to be spared. "I'm Grant," he managed, voice rusty with disuse. "You're safe here. I'll do what I can." He settled her on his bed, the same bed he'd planned to sit on to write goodbye, then ran for water, tore clean strips from an old sewing cloth, and tried to remember anything his late wife had ever said about bringing a child into this world. The bleeding looked wrong. Too much. Too fast. The girl's eyes fluttered open, startling, clear blue in a feverish face. "Riley," she whispered. "Riley Callahan. They said they'd find me no matter where I ran." "Who's they?" Grant asked, though his gut already knew the shape of the answer. "Sterling Blackwood," she breathed, pain twisting her features. "My father. He sold me to pay for his cards." Blackwood said the baby was his property. The name clenched something cold inside Grant's chest. Everyone from 3 counties over knew Blackwood, water rights, hire guns, judges bought like steers, and whispers about girls who went missing and never came back. If Riley had made it this far, his riders were likely a ridge behind her. Outside, the earth gave a warning of its own. Hoofbeats, measured and many, climbing from the dry wash. Grant checked the cabin with a soldier's eye. Thick pine walls would swallow rounds. 1 door and 2 windows meant he could watch angles, but a man could be trapped in a box as easily as defended by it. Another contraction cracked through Riley's body. She clutched the blanket and bit down a cry. He took her hand, big fingers swallowing her smaller ones. "I'm here," he said, steadying his breath to lend her some of it. "We'll get you through." He loaded the Winchester with motions he hadn't forgotten, then set it near the door. His grave yawned in the yard, a rectangular shadow in the cruel light, and he understood it for what it was now, not a finish line, but a border he had stepped back from. Boots hit dirt outside, 6 sets at least, moving together, crisp as drill. Grant lifted the curtain with 2 fingers. Riders crested the hill. Tight formation, dust boiling around iron. At their front sat a tall man with silver hair and a coat cut finer than any cloth belonged in this county. Eyes flat as river stone. Sterling Blackwood. The man halted his horse with a tug of the reins he probably used on people the same way. "Ellison," he called, voice smooth and sour. "You've got something that belongs to me." "Nothing in this house is yours," Grant called back through wood and heat. Riley's fingers tightened around the sheet, a prayer and a promise in one small motion. The baby kicked hard. Her breath hitched. "It's coming," she gasped. "It's coming now." Grant's mind jumped tracks and chose. He could take his rifle and die loud in the yard, leave a girl and her child to bleed out in his bed, or he could stay and fight on a different front first. He rolled his sleeves and set to work. "You hold on," he told her, voice low and firm. "You and that little one fight with me." The first crack of a pistol shattered glass, spraying the floor with glittering chips. Grant swore, ducked, and returned a shot through the window frame, hearing a man curse and fall. Riley cried out not from fear, but from life forcing its way into the room. The sound tore something open in Grant that had been locked in iron for too long. "Breathe," he coached, hand-braced, eyes flicking from door to mother and back. "You're almost there." Outside, Blackwood's tone turned lazy and lethal. "Hand over my property and walk away with your skin. Defy me, and I salt this ground with fire." Smoke curled past the sill. Someone had thrown a torch. Heat licked along the cabin's edge. "Grant," Riley gasped, voice thin as thread, "promise me he won't take her." He met her eyes and nodded once, the kind of oath that anchors deep. "I promise," he said, and the words settled inside him like roots. A heartbeat later, a thin, fierce cry split the air. Grant felt his throat close. He lifted the child with shaking hands, wrapped her in his clean shirt, and checked for breath. Strong. Alive. "A girl," he choked, a rough laugh breaking loose. Riley's lips curved. "Hope," she whispered, fading fast. "Hope Ellison." Then her eyes fixed on some far country, and the stillness that followed was louder than gunfire. Grant laid a trembling kiss against her cooling temple. "I'll keep it," he said to the promise she had pinned on him. The fire found a seam and roared. The doorframe spat sparks. He slung the Winchester, tucked the tiny bundle against his chest, kicked open the trap to the root cellar, and slipped into the cool dark beneath the floorboards, counting steps. Outside, ash drifted like pale snow. He eased out behind the shed, circled wide through prickly pear and mesquite, and climbed the low rise behind Blackwood's men. Another volley barked. 2 riders toppled, and Grant glanced left in surprise. A woman in a dust-gray duster and a badge glinting at her lapel worked a rifle with smooth, practiced motions. She tipped her hat a fraction, without looking over. "Deputy U.S. Marshal Nora Hayes," she said, breath even. "Heard your place might get lively." Grant nodded once, tucking Hope closer. "Lively's one word," he said. They flanked the yard together, moving silent through smoke and heat. Blackwood turned as the wind changed, smoke curling back into his fine coat, surprise sliding over his features at the sight of a law badge where he expected fear. "Marshal," he drawled, lifting 2 fingers from the reins. "This is a matter of property and contract. Not your business." Nora Hayes' answer was the slick click of a hammer easing back. "Sterling Blackwood," she called, voice carrying plain and hard. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, extortion, and trafficking. Drop your iron, tell your men to do the same, and step down nice." Blackwood smiled like a knife. "You have no proof worth a judge in this county." "Funny thing," she said, "we brought our own." From the east, Ridge slid 2 more deputies, and from the wash a 4th crawled up, rifles at the ready. Blackwood's gaze flicked, counting angles, measuring odds. He calculated men and iron same as he priced water and land. "Last chance," Nora said. "You walk or you fall." His hand twitched toward his pistol. Grant didn't wait. He fired first, the shot ringing clean, knocking Blackwood's gun wide with the kind of accuracy a man gets when everything left that matters fits in one arm. Nora's round followed, faster than a rattler, true as a plumb line, and one of Blackwood's hired guns pitched backward into the dirt. In the space of a breath the yard turned roar and smoke, the kind of short, brutal storm the law tries to keep off decent porches. Grant's world tightened to 3 points: the weight of a rifle, the rise and fall of the small chest against his shirt, and the tall figure on the bay horse whose money had built a fence around other people's lives. A rider charged. Nora dropped him with a clinical shot to the shoulder. Another swung to flank. The deputy in the wash cut his stirrup leather and sent him tumbling. Grant ducked behind a split rail, squeezed the trigger once, heard a grunt, moved again. Fire ate through the cabin's eaves, and the roof gave a sigh, collapsing inward as if a tired beast laid down at last. Grant didn't look back. Behind the smoke line, Blackwood's face shifted from smug to furious. He spurred forward, trying to break the ring, but his horse balked at the sudden flame and smell of burning resin. "Ellison," he shouted, pointing as if pointing could turn the tide. "Hand over what's mine, and I'll spare your miserable hide." The answer rose from Grant before he could think to shape it. "She's not a ledger entry," he snapped, voice carrying with a strength he hadn't felt in years. "And you don't get to claim what you break." The sentence cost Blackwood a sliver of control. He yanked too hard. His mount half reared. Nora slid sideways, using the moment, and put a round clean through the man's gun arm. The pistol fell, thudding in dust. The remaining riders saw the light go out of their pay and chose the safest creed out here. Save your own skin. Two fled south. One tossed his weapon and raised both hands high. The yard went suddenly quiet except for the crack of timbers and the low cry of a newborn who did not care about men and their pride. Nora stepped in, boots burning to black at the toes, and cuffed Blackwood as he swore names that wouldn't help him where he was going. She nodded once to Grant, eyes flicking to the bundle he held. "She all right?" "She's breathing," Grant said, voice unsteady. "And that's more than I had when the sun came up." Nora's expression softened by a hair. "We'll get you both to town," she said. "Doc Carter owes me 2 favors and a stitch." Grant looked to the ruin of the cabin. The bed where Riley had fought, the table he had meant for a letter, the wall where his past had hung in a neat row of regrets, and felt no urge to sift the ashes. He had a promise to pay in full, and pay it he would. The ride to town felt like crossing a line drawn in dust. The deputies kept a steady flank, eyes on the hills. Blackwood, trussed and scowling, spat words no one bothered to answer. Hope snuggled against Grant's heartbeat and slept the way babies do after a hard arrival, small and absolute. In Cedar Bluff, doors opened and faces peered, and people who had swallowed fear for years finally let it out in a whisper. Nora turned Blackwood over with a simple statement and a packet of paper thick enough to make a judge sit straight. Statements, ledgers, payoffs, names. The kind of truth that can't be tucked under a rug once it's walked into the room with boots on. Doc Carter met Grant at the steps, hands clean, questions brief. He checked the baby, counted what doctors count, and wrapped her snug with a nod. "Strong," he said. "Mama." Grant swallowed. The word stuck. He shook his head. "The doctor's eyes cooled, then warmed again toward the child. "Then we make sure her start sticks," he said. A matron from the church pressed a warm bowl into Grant's free hand and fussed at the blanket, then fussed at him for not fussing enough. She learned quickly that hope would yell if swaddled too tight, and sleep if you hummed low and steady. Grant learned it, too, and hummed until his own throat eased. Days hooked together in a quiet chain. Papers moved. Men who had smirked in shadow learned to speak in daylight. Blackwood found that the net he had used to catch others could be pulled up by hands not on his payroll. Nora wrote and rode and did not stop until the trail ended where it should, behind bars, and before a judge who could no longer pretend not to see. Grant did what a man does when the center of his life is small enough to fit in his forearms. He built a cot from scrap slats, mended a fence with borrowed tools, and took the long way around the burnt timbers when he walked back to the ranch to salvage what remained. He dug a different hole where the first one had gaped, no longer a grave for himself, but a resting place for the weight he'd carried too long. He laid Riley to earth with clean hands and a straight spine, said her name, and the name she had chosen for a child, and promised again out loud what he had sworn already in smoke and heat: "I'll keep you free." Nights were not simple. Hope woke with small cries and enormous needs. Grant woke with old ghosts and new vows. Sometimes he dozed upright in the rocker with the baby on his chest and frowned even in sleep. Sometimes dawn found him standing at the window, watching the eastern sky color and counting the choices he would not undo. The people in town assumed to circle around him. Mrs. Ledbetter from the dry goods with odd-shaped bottles and opinions, Doc with firm instructions, the church sisters with a rotation of casseroles that could stand up to any appetite, and a harsher rotation of gossip that Grant did not feed. The story walked without him, A young woman who ran, a baby who lived, a man who stayed when it counted. He did not argue with people's need to make sense of it. He only made sure bread was on the table and firewood was stacked and tiny socks were kept in pairs. Winter edged in, blue and sharp. The rebuilt cabin smelled of new pine and coffee and talc. Hope learned to fix her eyes on light and then on faces. She learned that a deep voice humming meant full belly and safe hands. Grant learned how to mind the pot with one arm and shell beans with the other, how to soften his step so a floorboard wouldn't creak, how to smile without feeling a tear. Nora stopped by when her circuit brought her close. She didn't linger, never pried beyond what was offered. She checked on legal threads like a person keeping fences tight, and she held the baby with awkward care that grew easy over time. "She looks like she knows more than we do," Nora said once, and Hope blinked solemnly as if to agree. On a clear morning painted with frost, a letter came from the judge's clerk with language plain enough for any rancher to parse. The charges stuck. The sentences would, too. Water would flow by law again. Men who had watched their daughters cross the street rather than pass a certain gate stood straighter when they walked. It did not return what was lost. It did what it could. Grant took the paper to Riley's resting place and read it there, words catching on the wind. He didn't say much. He stood for a time, hat in hand, then went home where a tiny girl had learned to track the sound of his boots and kick happy at the sight of him. Months slipped into a rhythm that felt like life instead of survival. Hope discovered her fists and then her laugh. Grant discovered that some aches quiet when a child's fingers close around your thumb. He patched the roof, fixed a hinge, and lined a shelf with the few books that hadn't burned. He set the Colt at the back of a drawer and left it there. He did not touch the old hole behind the cabin. He let the spring rains claim it and the grass stitch it shut. One evening, standing in the doorway with the last light painting the hills, Grant realized the ranch wasn't a place to finish a story anymore. It was where one had started over without asking permission, the way some things do when given the smallest chance. He breathed easier without noticing he'd been holding his breath. The land still bit and the work still ached, but it felt like a world that could be tended, not a sentence to serve. He leaned a shoulder against the frame and listened to Hope babble at nothing in particular and thought, with a quiet that surprised him, that he was glad he hadn't left. He did not call it grace. He called it staying. Some truths come late and make up for the delay by landing hard. Grant Ellison thought his days had narrowed to a point so sharp it could cut him clean from the world. He believed that love buried with his wife, purpose gone with his herd, and hope boiled off in a summer that cracked the earth. But the day a young woman collapsed at his gate and begged him to save the life inside her, the story changed without asking his consent. He had taken a shovel to his future that morning. By sundown he was carrying it in his arms, wrapped in his own shirt, loud and alive, and insisting on food every couple of hours. That pivot, small and absolute, did not come dressed in speeches. It came in chores and choices, in the stubborn work of keeping a promise when no one is watching. It came in saying a name at a graveside and not letting fear or fire undo what a brave girl had fled for. Folks like to draw neat lines around courage, to box it in with gun smoke and big words. Out here it often looks like something else. A man who had nothing left deciding to hold a newborn steady while the walls burn. A deputy who keeps writing paperwork across 3 counties until power runs out of places to hide. Neighbors who reopen their doors a crack at a time and let trust back in with the sunlight. When people ask later what made Grant stay, he sometimes shrugged and said there was a baby to feed. That answer is plainer than some men want. It is also the size of most of the good that gets done. Hope grew through winter and into the kind of spring that sets bluebonnets along the fence line in shy stitches. She learned to sit up, then pull herself, then topple into his lap with a laugh that unclenched things in him he hadn't known were still clenched. Grant learned the map of her tiny moods, the difference between hungry and tired, the prime moment to settle her before a storm spooked the windows. He found himself telling stories into the soft crown of her hair, about cows that once pawed this dirt, about a woman named Riley who ran until she couldn't and still chose for her child before she chose for herself, about a promise that got spoken twice and kept every day after. He didn't make those stories bigger than they were. He made them steady. Cedar Bluff changed, too, in ways that didn't earn headlines but mattered the most. A storekeeper learned to say no to certain men without looking down. A ranch hand who had watched his sister vanish 5 years back finally spoke names in a courtroom and was heard. The river ran a shade freer under paper orders that said it must, and some fields learned green again. The land still had its temper. So did the people. But there was less whispering and more talk. Nora Hayes came by on a summer noon with a new crease at the corner of her mouth and news that the last of the cases had closed like they were supposed to. She leaned on the fence and watched Hope totter along it with both hands gripping the rail and said, "That one's got balance." Grant nodded and grinned without meaning to. "She had practice," he said. "First steps in a world that swayed more than most." They stood a while without filling the air with words. Some friendships look like that out here. Two people facing the same wind from different angles. When Nora rode off, Grant lifted Hope and waved. Until the dust settled again. He didn't make big plans. He mended and cooked and stacked and planted. He put aside a little money in a jar and learned to sleep more nights than not. He taught Hope to pat the old mare's neck with a flat palm and say easy, in a voice that would never scare a creature. He showed her where the creek undercuts in spring and where to step around prickly pear. He set his hat on her head and laughed when it slid down over her eyes. He remembered what it felt like to want the next day. People sometimes want a lesson at the end of a tale. Grant never set himself up as a teacher. But if you asked him what all this meant, he might say this much: age and grief will try to convince you that shutting the door keeps you safe. It doesn't. It only keeps out the very things that could set you right again. Kindness is a risk. So is telling the truth. So is picking up a child and saying, "Not on my watch," when a man with money calls her a line item. Those risks might not make you rich. They might scorch your roof and cost you sleep. They might also draw a line under your name that you're proud to see. On a late afternoon when the light turned the hills the color of wheat and the rebuilt porch boards glowed warm, Grant sat with Hope tucked against his side and watched the world settle. He could still point to everything he'd lost if he wanted to. He chose, instead, to count what fit in a small pair of hands and what burned in a very small chest that rose and fell against his ribs. He had believed the hole behind the cabin was meant for him. Turned out it held the man he used to be, the one who thought endings were the only thing left to write. The new life had been loud about her opinions from the first minute, and he was learning to listen. When the wind shifted, he caught the faintest hint of ash, a memory baked into the grain of the porch, and felt no pull toward it. He breathed the cedar and dust and a sweetness that might have been the neighbor's peach pie cooling on a windowsill. He did not call himself saved. He called himself busy, and blessed in the quiet way that stays when the noise dies down. And when night came and the stars stepped out one by one, he tipped his hat toward a grave he kept trimmed and a promise he kept daily, then carried his daughter in and shut the door behind them, not to keep the world out, but to keep their small world in, safe for one more ordinary, priceless night.